The city did not fall with a whisper, nor did it crumble in slow decay it burned, as though the gods themselves had dragged their torches through its heart. The morning had begun with the same cadence it always knew. Merchants haggling in the market square, the smell of baking bread curling through the narrow streets, the low chant of priests echoing off sun-bleached stone. But by midday, the sky was an unnatural black, the air thick with embers that rained like a crimson storm, and the screams of thousands rose above the roar of collapsing roofs. History tells us empires rot over centuries, their demise a patient undoing of politics and pride. But here on the single day an empire's fate was sealed in fire. Was it accident, treachery, or divine judgment? That is the question history has gnawed upon for centuries, and the one we will walk together into the flames to answer. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. For what happened on that day rippled far beyond the empire's charred gates, into the lives of strangers across seas and centuries. The fire began, so the chroniclers wrote, in the southern quarter, a district of tightly packed tenements and workshops where the air was always heavy with the stench of pitch, oil, and tallow. A place where sparks were as common as gossip, and a carelessly dropped lamp could undo a whole street in the time it took to drink a cup of watered wine. But this was no ordinary blaze. Witnesses spoke of multiple points of ignition, fires springing up in unnatural unison as if some unseen hand had orchestrated the inferno. The first flames licked at the timber balconies of the weaver's row, then devoured them, rushing upward in a torrent of heat so fierce that those nearest the source were swallowed before they could scream. The city guard, brave enough in battle, hesitated here, for against fire there was no sword, no shield, no formation. They hacked at burning beams. Bucket chains faltered in the choking smoke, and the wind, ever the traitor in such moments, whipped the embers across rooftops faster than men could move. And somewhere beyond the chaos, in the cool shadow of the imperial palace, the emperor is said to have stood upon his balcony, watching the horizon burn, his face unreadable. Whether he saw calamity or opportunity that day, only the flames could answer. By the second hour, the fire had leapt the stone canal that many had believed would act as a barrier, swallowing the merchant quarter in a surge of molten light. Entire fortunes turned to ash in moments, silks from the east curling into black ribbons, amphorae of oil bursting into pillars of fire, ledgers and contracts fluttering through the air like burning leaves before disintegrating. The streets, once bustling arteries of trade, became channels of panic, choked with carts piled high with whatever treasures could be seized in haste. A family idol, a chest of coins, a single goat. Mothers screamed for children lost in the crush. The elderly were abandoned in doorways when their steps faltered, and the city's famed bronze statues, emblems of its eternal power, began to sag and collapse under the relentless heat above it all. The wind carried not only smoke, but a strange, low moan, the collective sound of a people realizing their world was being erased in hours. The palace guard barred the main gates to the imperial district, not to keep the fire out, but to keep the desperate masses from spilling in. In that moment, the empire was divided not between citizen and foreigner, rich and poor, but between those who burned and those who watched. In the third hour, the city's great temple, its marble columns said to have been quarried from the mountains in the empire's dawn, caught fire from a single roof tile blown loose and glowing red. The flame crawled along the wooden beams beneath the gilded roof like a living thing, and when it reached the central dome, it roared as if the gods themselves had descended in rage. Priests tried to carry out the sacred relics, their white robes, streaked with soot, clutching icons and scrolls that had survived 100 winters but could not endure a single day's blaze. Some, overcome by despair, refused to leave, chanting the hymns of the dead as the roof groaned and collapsed around them. Outside, thousands gathered, some weeping at the sight, others kneeling in the street as if the end of the temple marked the end of the Empire's covenant with the divine. The fire did not care for symbolism. It leapt from the shattered dome to the neighboring library, where shelves of knowledge, histories, philosophies, the wisdom of generations vanished into a swirling black sky. By then, even the Emperor could no longer stand idle. The sight of the city's spiritual and intellectual heart collapsing in one breath forced him from his balcony and into a chamber where advisors argued not about how to save the city, but how to save the throne. But how to save the throne not by the fourth hour. The fire had become a living siege, encircling the heart of the city with a ring of heat so intense that even stone walls wept moisture and split under the strain. The air shimmered not with sunlight, but with the distorted glare of 1,000 small infernos feeding one great hunger. In the streets, order had collapsed entirely. Soldiers, stripped of their chain and helmets, joined the throngs fleeing with what little they could carry, their loyalty to the Empire evaporating in the same heat that curled the banners. Above the city gates, thieves prowled through the smoke, cutting purses from the belts of the dead and prying gold teeth from the jaws of the dying. For disaster breeds opportunity for those without conscience. Yet, even amidst the chaos, there were flashes of desperate humanity, a mason shielding his neighbor's children. Beneath a fallen lintel, a slave carrying his wounded master through a wall of flame. An old woman refusing to leave her burning home until the last of her chickens was freed. From the palace, the Emperor's messengers were dispatched with contradictory orders, first to fight the blaze, then to abandon the outer quarters, then to torch certain streets to halt the fires. Advance. Some whispered these last orders were not born of strategy, but of design. For the districts chosen to burn first belonged to those who had defied the Emperor's tax decrees. If this was true, then the fire was no accident, but a weapon. By the 5th hour, the river lifeblood of the city was choked with the living and the dead alike. Hundreds had thrown themselves into its murky depths to escape the inferno, clutching to rafts of driftwood, capsized fishing boats. Even the carcasses of livestock swept downstream. The current bore away not only bodies, but the last illusions of safety. For the fire, relentless as any invading army, leapt across the water on bridges of burning debris, setting the far bank aflame. Bargemen, who once ferried goods to the Empire's markets, now rowed their families toward the countryside, ignoring the cries of those begging for passage. For the weight of another soul could mean the difference between survival and the rivers. Pull. The Emperor's Navy's small patrol ships moored downstream received orders to form a cordon and turn back any vessel that might carry dissenters or thieves out of the city. Yet the sailors, seeing the black horizon and hearing the screams carried on the wind, abandoned their posts and joined the flight. By now, the sky had turned the color of hammered bronze, the sun reduced to a pale coin smudged by smoke, and the ground beneath the city stone streets radiated such heat that even the dogs, wild with panic, hurled themselves into the flames, rather than endure another moment of suffocating air. Somewhere deep in the imperial quarter, the Emperor's scribes were already drafting proclamations not of loss, but of victory, words that would recast the day's ruin as a cleansing, a rebirth, an act of providence. History, after all, would belong to whoever held the pen when the ashes cooled out. By the 6th hour, the outer gates had been thrown open not by imperial decree, but by the sheer crush of humanity forcing them apart. Streams of refugees poured into the countryside, their faces streaked with soot and salt, clutching whatever scraps of their lives had survived the chaos. Some stumbled blindly into enemy-held territories beyond the Empire's border, too desperate to remember that the lands outside the city walls were as dangerous as the flames within. The Imperial Guard, unable to contain the tide, abandoned their posts entirely, leaving the gates yawning like the jaws of a wounded beast. Out on the plains, columns of smoke rose like black obelisks, visible for miles, drawing the attention of foreign scouts who would carry the news to rival kings. Before the day was done, inside the city, The fire now moved with an almost sentient malice, choosing its path with a precision no wind could explain, destroying the granaries first, then the workshops of the city's armorers, crippling both stomach and sword. Some whispered of saboteurs slipping through the smoke, unseen hands setting fresh blazes in districts yet untouched, while others muttered that no mortal could wield such ruin so swiftly. In the palace, the emperor convened his inner council in the Hall of Ivory, where the light from the high windows flickered like torchlight despite the midday hour. Maps of the city were spread before them, each quarter marked in red, the blaze, advancing toward the palace itself. And still, the emperor hesitated, not because he feared for his life, but because he knew that if the fire reached the throne, it would not just consume his reign, it would consume the myth of the empire itself. By the 7th hour, the fire had breached the artisan quarter, where the city's finest craftsmen had worked for generations to supply the empire with its most coveted treasures. Jewelers whose hands had set gems for 3 dynasties, glassblowers whose wares shimmered like captured sunlight, armorers whose steel had turned the tide of battles. Now, their life's work became fuel. Glass furnaces burst in violent blossoms of molten shards, cascading through the streets like jeweled rain, while stores of lacquer, dye, and resin sent up noxious clouds that choked the lungs and painted the smoke in shrill colors: green, violet, crimson, as if the air itself were bleeding. Guild leaders, proud men and women who had once dined with senators, were reduced to scavengers, dragging cars of half-finished goods toward the gates, their eyes wild with the knowledge that coin could not buy what no longer existed. In the midst of the destruction, a single bell tolled from the Hall of Guilds, struck not by a human hand, but by the collapse of the tower roof. The sound, warped by heat and distance, rolled through the streets like a death knell for the city's soul. Yet even here, amidst ruin, there were whispers that the emperor's private guard had been seen looting the vaults of the goldsmiths and taking crates of weaponry from the armorer's hall before the flames reached them. Whether these were acts of survival or premeditated theft, no one could say. But one truth was becoming clear to all who fled, fought, or simply watched. This was not a disaster the empire would recover from in a season, nor even a generation. This was the day the empire's foundations cracked, and no mortar could make them whole again. By the 8th hour, the fires had swallowed the city's great forum, the beating heart of political life, where senators once debated the fate of provinces and poets recited verses under the open sky. Now, the marble columns were blackened and cracked, their inscriptions blurred by soot and flame, and the once proud steps were slick with melting wax and blood. Inside the Senate House, some of the city's most powerful men had gathered, attempting to rally what remained of order, their voices raised over the roar of destruction. But even their words seemed to fall like ash in the wind, impotent against the tide of chaos sweeping through the streets. Outside, mobs surged, fueled by fear and fury, setting fire to the homes of the elite and tearing down statues of leaders long dead. The line between citizen and rebel blurred, as desperate souls seized the moment to settle old scores or grasp at fleeting power. Rumors spread of secret conspiracies, of factions who had welcomed the fire as a cleansing force, and others who plotted to use it as a cover for assassination and theft. The empire's laws, once etched in stone and blood, were now smoke drifting away on the hot breeze. And high above it all, the emperor's voice crackled through the hastily erected towers of the city's remaining messengers, decrees alternating between calls for calm and threats of brutal retribution. In this hour, the empire was not a monolith but a fracture, splintering along every fault line of loyalty, fear, and ambition. By the 9th hour, the blaze had engulfed the city's great aqueducts, those marvels of engineering that had carried life-giving water from distant hills into the heart of the empire. As wooden supports collapsed into the swollen rivers below, the flow of water slowed, then halted altogether, leaving fountains dry and wells barren, without water. The efforts to douse the fire grew desperate and futile, buckets passed hand to hand became empty, and even the great cisterns began to run low. The heat became a cruel tyrant, sapping the strength of firefighters and citizens alike, turning once stalwart defenders into shadows stumbling through smoke-choked alleys. In this hour, the city's lifeblood was cut, and with it, the fragile hope of salvation. As the sun dipped lower, the fire's fury seemed to intensify, its tongues licking higher into the sky, casting long, dancing shadows over ruins that had moments before teemed with life. Those who remained awake and conscious whispered of omens, birds falling from blackened skies, the earth trembling beneath feet, and of the gods' silence in the face of such devastation. Deep within the imperial palace, the emperor wrestled with a growing realization. The empire he had ruled was not merely burning, it was dying by the 10th hour. As dusk bled into night, the city's flames became an eerie beacon visible for miles across the empire's vast lands. Refugees, exhausted and hollow-eyed, stumbled through the outskirts, their bodies coated in ash and sweat, their minds haunted by the screams and sights they would carry forever. Villages far beyond the city walls heard the distant roar and knew something ancient and terrible had been unleashed. Inside the palace, shadows lengthened as the Emperor's council debated desperate measures, plans to sacrifice entire districts to create fire breaks, schemes to rally mercenaries to restore order, and whispered pleas for divine intervention from priests whose faith was as shaken as their city. The Emperor himself retreated to a private chamber, surrounded by relics of past glories and portraits of ancestors who had faced wars and plagues, yet never a disaster of this magnitude. Alone, he faced the crushing weight of legacy and failure, the burden of an empire's dreams, now collapsing into smoldering ruin. Outside, the fire did not pause. It clawed through wooden bridges and market stalls, through homes and temples alike, indifferent to prayer or plea. And as night fell, the city was no longer a place but a crucible, forging a new history from the embers of the old. By the 11th hour, the city lay half in shadow, half in an unrelenting inferno that painted the night sky in shades of hellish red and orange. The air was thick with smoke so dense it blotted out stars and swallowed voices, turning cries of despair into ghostly echoes. The once majestic streets, lined with colonnades and statues, had become rivers of molten stone and ash, carving paths through the ruins. Among the desperate, stories began to spread, tales of entire families lost in cellars sealed by collapsing beams, of heroes who risked their lives to lead others to safety, and of those who succumbed, their final breaths mingling with the smoke. In the imperial palace, courtiers whispered of conspiracies, accusing one another of arson and treason as fear eroded trust. The emperor, trapped in the gilded cage of his own making, wrestled with decisions that could damn not only his reign, but the future of the empire itself. Would he use the devastation to forge a new order, or simply watch as the flames consumed what remained? Outside the palace walls, the fire's insatiable appetite showed no sign of abating, carving the city's fate with every crackling blaze and collapsing beam. History was not a distant observer, it was the fire itself, consuming and remaking all in its path. By the 12th hour, the fire had consumed the city's famed theater district, where once the laughter and tears of countless dramas had echoed. Beneath marble arches, now, the stages where actors had portrayed gods and men alike were reduced to blackened skeletons, the scripts and masks lost to ash. The patrons who once filled these seats, noblemen, philosophers, and commoners, were scattered or dead, their stories abruptly silenced. The smoke here carried a bitter tang of burnt wood and lost dreams, a reminder that culture itself was a fragile flame easily snuffed out. Beyond the ruins, refugees carried fragments of music and poetry in their memories, the last echoes of a civilization unraveling. Within the imperial court, news of the theater's destruction was met not with grief but calculation. Some saw opportunity in the cultural vacuum to reshape society's values, while others mourned the loss of an identity that had once bound the empire together. Yet even as these debates raged, the flames crept closer to the palace walls, threatening to erase the line between destruction and dominion. The empire was no longer a city or a throne. It was a question burning in the hearts of all who survived. What would rise from these ashes? By the 13th hour, the city's once glorious marketplace, a labyrinth of stalls selling spices from distant lands, fabrics dyed with the colors of sunsets, and trinkets carved by skilled hands, was no more than a smoldering wasteland. The scent of exotic goods, once intoxicating, was replaced by the acrid smell of burnt leather and scorched earth. Traders who had amassed fortunes here found their wealth reduced to ash, their dreams of prosperity collapsing alongside the charred remains of their shops. Among the fleeing masses, there were whispers of betrayal, rumors that some merchants had stockpiled grain and water, choosing profit over the lives of their neighbors. The social fabric of the empire, already stretched thin by corruption and class divides, frayed further in the heat of the disaster. Meanwhile, in the shadowed halls of the imperial palace, factions vie for influence, each eager to claim credit for the city's salvation or to blame others for its destruction. The emperor's once unquestioned authority was now a fragile thing, tested by fire and fear alike. As the night deepened, the fire's glow became a haunting reminder that the empire's heart was breaking, and that the future was uncertain, written in smoke and flame. By the 14th hour, the city's libraries, repositories of knowledge amassed over centuries, succumbed to the relentless flames. Scrolls and codices, fragile vessels of wisdom, curled and blackened, their secrets lost in the choking smoke. Scholars who had devoted their lives to preserving history and philosophy fought desperately to salvage what they could, forming human chains to pass manuscripts from burning shelves to open courtyards, only to see their efforts undone by the insatiable fire. Outside, citizens huddled around makeshift fires, sharing fragments of lost lore by the flickering light, clutching memories that were all that remained. The destruction of these sacred archives struck a blow not only to the city's intellect, but to the soul of the empire itself, severing its connection to the past and leaving future generations to piece together a shattered legacy. In the imperial chambers, this cultural loss was met with a cold calculation. Some saw it as a chance to rewrite history in the image of those who would rise from the ashes. The fire was no longer merely a force of destruction, it had become a crucible in which the empire's identity would be reforged or forever lost. By the 15th hour, the city's great hospitals and healing houses, havens where the sick and wounded once found respite, had been reduced to ruins or repurposed as shelters for the displaced. Physicians and caregivers, overwhelmed and exhausted, moved like ghosts among the suffering, their hands stained with soot and blood, tending to burns and broken bones with scarce supplies. The cries of the injured echoed through the streets, mingling with the relentless crackle of flames, a grim chorus underscoring the fragility of life amidst catastrophe. Those who had once wielded power and influence found themselves powerless in the face of indiscriminate destruction, their titles meaningless as plague and fire ravaged alike. Meanwhile, the emperor's emissaries struggled to maintain communication with outlying provinces, sending urgent pleas for aid that would arrive too late or never at all. The empire's networks of care and command were unraveling, stretched thin by the overwhelming scale of the disaster. And yet, even in the darkest hours, acts of compassion and courage shone through. The nurse who refused to abandon her ward, the soldier who carried a child to safety, the stranger who shared the last morsel of bread. In these moments, the true resilience of the empire was tested not in stone or steel, but in the hearts of its people. By the 16th hour, the city's once majestic walls, built to withstand invaders and time itself, were compromised, cracked by heat and battered by falling debris. The outer ramparts, symbols of imperial strength, had become fractured skeletons, offering little defense against the firestorm within. As the walls crumbled, so did the illusion of invincibility that had sustained the empire for generations. Beyond the collapsing stone, the countryside waited, watching, wary and calculating. Neighboring kingdoms sent envoys, their faces massive concern, yet their minds scheming over the power vacuum soon to come. Within the city, panic turned to despair, and despair to a simmering anger that simmered beneath the smoke-choked air. Citizens who had survived the blaze found themselves homeless, hungry, and hunted by both desperation and suspicion. The emperor, once a distant figure atop his throne, was now a man burdened by the weight of ruin, forced to reckon with the fragile threads that still held his empire together. The fire, which had begun as a physical conflagration, had now ignited a political inferno, a struggle for survival that would shape the empire's fate long after the last ember died. By the 17th hour, the night deepened, but the fire's rage showed no mercy, turning the city into a surreal landscape of glowing ruins and dancing shadows. The surviving populace, exhausted, broken, and grieving, wandered through streets, unrecognizable beneath layers of ash and fallen timbers. Families were scattered, kinship bonds severed in the chaos, replaced by a desperate instinct to survive at any cost. Raiders and opportunists, sensing the empire's weakness, prowled the outskirts, preying on the vulnerable and stealing what little remained. Amid the ruin, the emperor convened a council not of generals or senators, but of survivor smiths, priests, merchants, those who embodied the resilience of the empire's spirit. Their voices, ragged but determined, debated not only reconstruction, but transformation, how to rebuild a city that had been both cradle and coffin of an empire's glory. Yet, beneath these discussions lay a haunting question. Could the empire rise again from this crucible, or was this conflagration the final chapter of its story? The fire had burned for a day, but its shadow stretched into eternity, reshaping the destiny of all who lived through its hell. By the 18th hour, as the flames began to wane and the first tentative stars pierced the smoke-choked sky, the survivors gathered amidst the smoldering rubble, faces illuminated by flickering embers and haunted by the weight of loss. Silent prayers mingled with whispered plans. Some spoke of revenge, others of exile, and still others of forging new alliances. From the ashes of betrayal, the city's once vibrant streets, now scarred and silent, bore witness to the fragile rebirth of a people who had seen their world undone and were forced to reimagine their place within it. News of the disaster spread beyond the empire's borders, carried by fleeing refugees and weary traders, seeding fear and opportunity in equal measure among rival states. In the imperial palace, the emperor walked alone through halls darkened by soot and shadow, his thoughts a tempest of grief, guilt, and the steely resolve that only those who have faced utter ruin can know. The fire that had consumed a day's worth of history had rewritten the empire's future, and the choices made in these quiet hours would echo for generations to come. The story was far from over, but the empire would never be the same. By the 19th hour, the empire stood at a crossroads between memory and oblivion, its people scattered like ashes in the wind, yet bound by a shared trauma that refused to fade. Survivors, their faces etched with soot and sorrow, began to piece together fragmented lives amid the ruins, finding strength in whispered stories of heroism, sacrifice, and the stubborn persistence of hope. Across the empire's remaining provinces, governors sent envoys to assess the damage and secure borders against opportunistic foes, eager to exploit the capital's fall. The emperor, burdened by the weight of leadership and loss, faced the daunting task of forging a new identity for a realm whose foundations had been scorched, but not entirely destroyed. In this moment, the fire's legacy crystallized not as an end, but as a brutal reckoning with the empire's flaws and frailties. The burning had stripped away illusions of grandeur and permanence, revealing a fragile humanity beneath. And as dawn approached, the survivors understood that rebuilding would demand not only brick and mortar, but a reckoning with the past that had led them to this inferno. The empire that burned for a day was forever changed, not just in its ruins, but in its very soul. By the 20th and final hour, the first light of dawn crept over the charred horizon, casting long shadows across a city transformed into a vast graveyard of smoke and ruin. The air, once thick with the roar of flames and cries of the desperate, now held a brutal silence, the kind that follows devastation, pregnant with the weight of what was lost and what might yet be salvaged. Survivors gathered in small clusters, eyes hollow but resolute, sharing stories and mourning futures that would never come to be. The Emperor emerged from the palace's battered remains, a solitary figure against a landscape both broken and strangely beautiful in its rawness. His gaze swept over the devastation, a kingdom that had burned for a day yet would shape history. For centuries, in this moment of fragile peace, the Empire's fate hung in balance, tethered to the choices of those willing to rebuild from ashes, to confront the betrayals and sacrifices etched into the city's bones. The fire had been both an end and a beginning, a reminder that empires, no matter how mighty, are mortal. And so, as Candle and Coffin draws this story to a close, we are left with the enduring question: what truths lie buried beneath the ashes of history, waiting for those bold enough to uncover them? If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shape our world.